All right. Hi, folks. Welcome to this panel on the glass ceiling and international perspective. I'm Tom Ferguson. I'm a chair. I'm also a commentator. We have three presentations, and we'll simply just go through them one after the other, and then Pia Mullaney is here and will comment. So the first presentation is by Alexandra Casarico and Sarah Wojciechowski. I hope I've got that right. And why don't you just, everybody will speak. The papers are presentations are roughly 15 minutes apiece. I do keep time, but not, I hope, obnoxiously. Then the comments will take a little shorter, and then we'll throw the open to the floor for discussion.
So, good morning, everybody. The research I'm presenting is joint work with Sarah Wojciechowski and Tony Atkinson, and it relates to the analysis of top incomes and the glass ceiling, and we also benefited from the collaboration of Facundo Alvaredo, Jorgen Modasli, and Jakob Zogard as far as the elaboration of data for Spain, Norway, and Denmark are concerned. So what do we try to do in this paper? We would like to assess the presence and the evolution of gender differences at the top of the income distribution and try to understand how different income components contribute to either generating or moderating gender disparity at the top of the income distribution. And in order to do so, we are using data which have never been used in order to assess gender inequalities, that is, top income data from tax records for a selection of countries which apply individual taxation. And given that they apply individual taxation, we can assess separately the income of men and the income of women. Currently, the data that we have are rather heterogeneous. We have both microdata and tabulated data for recent year for Australia, Denmark, Norway, Spain, and the UK. And actually, this morning, just half an hour ago, we received the data for Italy. And we also have historical data for New Zealand, on which we have already worked, and also for Canada, on which we are still working at the moment. So in order to frame our research question in a more general context, let me start from the two words that we have in the title, meaning glass ceiling and top incomes. So I think that the word glass ceiling has more or less entered everyday discourse, and we generally use it to refer to the fact that women find it harder than men to move up in the wage distribution, or that they face a stronger headwind as they progress in their career. More formally, we can refer to this definition proposed by Albrecht and co-authors in one of their papers, according to which the glass ceiling is the phenomenon whereby women do quite well in the labor market up to a certain point, after which there is an effective limit on their prospects. And the fact that there is a glass ceiling would imply that women's wages fall behind men's one more at the top of the distribution rather than at the middle or at the bottom. So far, the glass ceiling story has been casted with reference to the wage distribution, and we can say that we can detect the glass ceiling when we see that the gender wage gap is larger at the top. And so given that the glass ceiling is very much a story which relates to the top of the distribution, we thought that it is interesting or important to look at it using top incomes data from tax record. And the literature on top incomes data, which was initiated by Piketty, pays little attention to the gender dimension. One potential reason for this is that this literature has initially evolved especially on the US and France, which do not adopt individual taxation. They have joint taxation, and therefore we cannot, let's say, observe separately the income of men and women, because what is subject to taxation is family income. So what this study does is just to present a cross-country analysis of the evolution of the presence of women at the top of the income distribution, shifting the focus from wages, from pay, from earnings to income, trying to analyze the contribution that, for instance, self-employment income or capital income give to the dynamics of gender inequality. We could think, for instance, that capital income or investment income are important sources of income at the top, and so including it can give us more information or better information on what happens at the top of the distribution. And at the same time, equality laws or laws outlawing discrimination are generally applied to employed work, but not to self-employment. And so again, just building in or having in the data also information on self-employment income can give us, let's say, a better or an additional measure of gender inequality. And as I said before, it's the first time that top incomes data are analyzed from a gender inequality angle, and so we can have an additional measure, an additional dimension through which we can analyze gender inequality, which is a measure based on total income. And these tax records data have a very good coverage of individuals at the top of the distribution. And so in this sense, we think that they are, let's say, a useful source of information to investigate this, this phenomenon. Let me add one thing. Differently from what is generally done in the labor economics literature, where we try to understand where, let's say, the gender wage gaps come from, whether it is individual characteristics which determine it, say, education, the sector where women work compared to men, or the experience that women have, or discrimination itself. This is something that we cannot investigate with our data, because tax records data do not have this type of information. But at the same time, I think that we are contributing to the understanding of this phenomenon simply by providing new evidence, new data. And it's rather complicated because, as I said at the beginning, the sources of information are rather heterogeneous. So we are trying to make an effort to make them as comparable as possible in order to have, let's say, a satisfactory cross-country analysis. And before turning to the results we currently have, as I said, it's work in progress. So, I mean, I'm just going to present what we have up to now. Let me just mention or refer to a few caveats that we need to have in mind when we try to use tax data from a gender perspective. And the first issue may be related to selection. The idea is that we only have a set of countries, and these are the countries for which individual taxation is applied. So one may think that we have a selected sample. A second issue has to do with the fact that tax authorities in different countries may have different rules in order to which they assign income to spouses within the couple. And even couples can differ, I mean, they have some margins of flexibility in deciding what income to attribute to the husband or to attribute to the wife. And a third concern or a third caveat we should keep in mind is that there may be gender differences in tax evasion and tax avoidance. So the literature on this point is not extremely developed, but the type of indication that we have is that from field experiments is that being female is negatively associated with the probability of evading taxes. And if we look at survey evidence, women seem to be more willing to comply. And so there are, let's say, gender gaps in attitudes towards tax evasions, and this seems to emerge also in lab experiments. But overall, we think that these factors will tend to dampen gender differences at the top of the income distribution. And so in this sense, it may be the case that the measures we find are a lower bound for, let's say, the true gender inequality, which is actually out there. This is just some more details on the data. So we have data for Australia for a period from 2001 to 2011, Denmark starting from 1980s. New Zealand is the country for which currently we have the longer time span. We have from 1953 up to now. We have Norway from the beginning of the 90s, Spain from the end of the 90s, and the UK from 1995. Some of the data are tabulated, some of the data are micro data. So let me start showing you some of the results. And here as a measure of, let's say, the glass ceiling, or as a measure of gender inequality, we are focusing on the share of women in top income groups. And so this is how you should, let's say, read this table. The top line refers to the share of women in the top 10%. Then as you move down, you have the share of women in the top 5, in the top 1, top 0.5, top 0.25, and top 0.1. So as you can see, if we look from 1995 to 2011, the proportion of women, the share of women in top income groups has been rising in the UK, especially in the top 10%, in the top 5%, but the rate of increase in the share of women is smaller at the top. So there has been an improvement, but we see more improvement in the lowest among the top percentiles rather than in the highest among the top percentiles. So it seems that the underrepresentation of women increases more sharply as one moves up the income scale. And in addition, the decline in the share of women as we move up the income scale seems to be larger now, at least as far as the UK is concerned, now than it was 15 years ago. So at the beginning of our period of analysis, if we try to move from the top 10% to the top 0.5%, the percentage of women falls by approximately 10 percentage points. Whereas if we make a comparable move now, the fall is larger, and it is approximately 14 percentage points. And the picture that we get by looking at net income rather than at gross income, as we did in the previous picture, is exactly the same. So let me just move to Denmark here. And what may look surprising is that actually, even though Denmark and the UK, in terms of overall inequality, are rather different countries, when it comes to the share of women in top income groups, they look quite similar. So as it happened for the UK at the beginning of the period, here it is actually 1980s, 20% of women 20% is the share of women in the top 10 percentile. It goes up over time to approximately 28%. This increase is sharper, as I said, in the top 5 and in the top 10%, whereas when we focus on the highest of the top percentiles, we see that the distribution is more compressed for Denmark than it was for the UK. And here you can see what happens to Norway. We tend to think of Norway as a country where there is more gender equality compared, for instance, to the UK. But actually what we see here is that all the curves we saw before, both for the UK and for Denmark, are actually shifted down, especially the top 10% and the top 5%. So there are fewer women at the top of the distribution, especially top 5 and top 10 in Norway, than there are in the UK and in Denmark. And again, this may look a bit surprising, but Spain, which is a Mediterranean country, we are not used to think of it as a particularly, as a champions in terms of gender equality, but Spain, together with Australia, as we will see in a minute, seems to be a country for which the share of women in the top income groups is larger compared to the other 3 countries we saw before. But notice that the pattern is always very similar. The top 10 is at the top of these pictures, and then you move down as you try to move up with the percentiles. And this is for Australia. Here we are using tabulated data. And actually, Australia is the country for which we have the largest share of women in the top income groups, together with Spain. And you see that the difference between what you have in the top 10, the top 5, and the top 1 is much closer. So this could be an indication that, let's say, the extent of the glass ceiling may be smaller in Australia than it is in the other countries we have seen or analyzed so far. And this is New Zealand. As I mentioned before, New Zealand is the country for which we have a longer time horizon. And here we see something we think it is interesting, because if you focus on the first period of analysis, we see a pattern that we don't see in recent data for the countries I showed you before. And namely, the share of women in the top 1% is higher than the share of women in the top 10%. So the red curve is higher than the blue curve, up until more or less the 1970, and starting from the 1970, we see a divergence of the curves, and we start seeing more women in the top 10% than women in the top 1%. And this goes on like this up until now. The increase in the share of women in the top 10% has been faster, and it has somehow leveled off in the last period. And so this is what we see for New Zealand, and we think it is quite interesting to point out that there was a time in which, at least in these countries, the position of women compared to men in the top of the distribution was rather different. Another way of presenting let's say, the glass ceiling issue using the data that we have is that of focusing on Pareto curves. And here we are just showing the Pareto curves for the UK for 2010, looking at the top 5%. The blue lines refers to men, the red lines refers to women. And the way you should interpret this curve is the following one. The fact that the curve for women is below the curve for men captures the fact that the share of women is lower than the share of men in the top 5%. And we have already seen it in the previous picture. The second element you should look at is just the slope of these curves. And the slope of these curves is the gradient in income as one moves up in the distribution. And what we see is that, the gradient is related to what we call the Pareto coefficient, and we see that the gradient is smaller for women than it is for men. The fact that the gradient is smaller indicates that as we move up, as we increase income, the distribution for women is less and less concentrated. So you have fewer and fewer women as you move up. So this could be another way of representing the extent of the glass ceiling, which focuses on the shape of the income distribution. Another way of representing the extent of the glass ceiling by using top income data is this picture. Actually, Sarah prepared it, where we look at gender equality in the top 5% and we combine Australia, Norway, and the UK. How should you read this picture? So we are looking at the period which goes from the early 90s for Norway, and we have more recent data for the UK and Australia. The color of the dots tell us something about the share of women in the top 5%. So the darker is the dot, the higher is the share of women. So Australia has more or less always the same share of women over the entire period. Norway is just increasing in terms of the share of women, and so is the UK. So this is just by looking at the color of the dots. But the other thing is just focusing on the position of these different curves. The position of these curves is given by the ratios of the Pareto coefficient for men and the Pareto coefficient for women. So it tells us something about the shape of the distribution. And if this ratio is just below 1, it means that there is a glass ceiling because the number of women dies out faster compared to the number of men. So what we see is that for Australia, this ratio is quite close to 1, which could be interpreted as an indication that the glass ceiling is not that serious, let's say, in Australia compared to the other two countries we are showing here. And if we look at Norway and the UK, we see that they start from very different positions. So the extent of the glass ceiling as measured by these ratios is higher in Norway at the beginning than it is in the UK. But over time, the two countries become closer to each other. So it is as if the extent of the glass ceiling is becoming less serious in Norway and more serious in the UK. And this is what we see for New Zealand. And as a match to the picture I showed you before, at the beginning of the period, we see that there are few women. The dots are basically white, meaning that we are at a share which is lower than 10%. But the ratio which measures the extent of the glass ceiling is actually greater than 1. So, the distribution for women at the top is more concentrated than the one we have for men. But these things change over time, as you can see from this picture. The last information, if I still have 2 minutes, right, has to do with the income composition. This is something that we are still working on. We would like, let's say, to investigate better, as I mentioned at the beginning, how the different income sources are contributing to generating this inequality. And this is the picture for the top 1% for the UK for men. And the red bars refer to the share of total income which comes from investment income. The yellow bar refers to employed income, and the blue bars refer to self-employed income. And what we see, if we compare this picture to the one we have for females, is that females are receiving a larger share of their income from investment. And this has always been the case, let's say, over the entire period, although, it seems that the share of Total income that women are receiving from investment is a bit on the declining side, especially in the last year we have in our data, and they are getting a lower share from earnings. Whereas as far as the shares of total income coming from self-employment, they are basically almost the same over the entire time period, both for men and for women. If we looked at the same data for Spain, we see more, let's say, striking changes in the composition, and with women earning a lot of investment income at the beginning of the period and earning now more wages, and therefore becoming more similar to men in terms of income composition over time. So let me conclude. I think that the evidence that so far we have, and the one which I presented here, suggests that in recent years, women increased their presence at the top 10% of the income distribution in all countries considered, but the increase doesn't seem to have reached the very top almost in all countries. So what are the next steps, given that this is work in progress? So first, we would like to extend our analysis also to include Italy and Canada, and missing data for some of the countries we already have, or for which we have already shown you some data. We would like to deepen, to extend our analysis by sources of income, because we think that this is an important part of the overall project. We would like to understand more about, for instance, also the age distribution, whether, let's say, according to the age you have, the income composition that you have is different, and the extent of gender disparities or the glass ceiling changes. And potentially we would like to focus also on the role of the crisis and differences in legislative and tax policies in order to explain some of the different patterns that we observe in the different countries. I think that's it. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next speaker is Judy Zui. And so you have to hit that thing.
Whoops. Okay.
Just try it
Right.
here.
I think
I
he's
think
loading.
the slides are probably getting loaded.
Yep.
Yep, okay.
Can I go back to
Sure.
the previous slide? Right.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My paper is a very different paper from Alexandra's, which is focused mainly on US data for a change. Alexandra's around the different parts of the world, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and other parts of Europe. But what is interesting about our paper is it's very much accounting-based. I'm an accounting professor, so this is not a cross-country analysis, and therefore any generalization needs to be made with a great deal of caution. And however, the exciting part is we have been able to collect data from the US only. I live in Hong Kong and China. Unfortunately, the data is not available for so many years. Therefore, we are not able to do empirical analysis on issues like board gender diversity, linking it to audit fees and audit choice. And this is one of the very first papers in accounting and auditing that has linked to a monitoring mechanism such as external audit. And this is the focus of the paper. But what is really exciting about this paper is we have this consultation paper on board diversity in Hong Kong with over 1,500 listed companies. And it incorporated many of the Chinese companies from the mainland as well, which are also listed in Hong Kong. And this consultation paper came out in September 2012, requiring the listed issuers and the general public to give views on a very innovative issue on board diversity. And this is against the background of many European countries, such as Norway, instituting a strict quota of 40, UK 25%. And therefore, what has the Hong Kong Stock Exchange done to do a survey of what other countries have done? But the only academic paper that was listed was this very preliminary draft of our paper on the demand board diversity and the demand for higher audit effort, which we have put in SSRN in 2008. However, this paper included, because we have to go through a review process, and it took us to revise and add data from 2008 until 2011. We have to add so many more years of data. So this final version of the paper is from 2001 to 2011 with US data from the corporate library. And hopefully it is undergoing the final round of review. Hopefully it would appear in Contemporary Accounting Research, the top journal in Canada and well recognized in the world. But the exciting part is, based on this paper, this is the only academic paper quoted for the consultation. And Hong Kong, you probably can't see this, but we have gone to be able to convince the policymakers that gender diversity on boards is a very, very important issue. So we have not gone down the strict quota demand, but we have actually asked all the listed companies to disclose how they have thought about gender diversity. And therefore, the nomination committee has to look into how many female directors they have and disclose to the market, disclose to all the public investors. So this is the kinds of impact that I guess any academics would like to have, that is to influence policy. And in a small way, we have been able to do so. So why are we interested in this paper? Of course, we would like to promote more diversity on boards, and one of which is gender. There are other aspects of diversity as well. And in accounting, in all other fields, there have been a significant increase in regulatory and academic interest about the role of gender diversity in improving corporate governance throughout the world. And as we were speaking, the last 2 days, the Hong Kong stock market has gone up more than 12% in the last 2 days. So this is how all the capital inflows are drawn to Hong Kong, which is apparently a much better governed market than the Chinese mainland market. So corporate governance is seen to be, a lifeline for Hong Kong listed companies. And all the literature review have shown that gender diverse boards exhibit better attendance. Female directors are more diligent. They are more likely to serve as members of audit committees. It translates to, another paper of ours, translates to higher earnings quality. Investors look at the earnings of different companies, and if the quality is being manipulated, then of course, investors do not have better information environment in order to make investment decisions. And board diversity also results in richer information environment with better quality. And as a result, there would be, with this better information environment, there will be better oversight and increased monitoring. And this is what we're trying to prove in this paper. Through external audit, female directors would demand better quality audit. And they would also demand more audit effort to be exerted by the external auditors, hence better monitoring, hence better information quality, and hence better corporate governance. So the linkage of the board diversity to a monitoring mechanism has never ever been done. And this is the innovation in this particular paper. And then higher audit quality is also shown to improve reporting quality. So there is a very close linkage, because the external auditors would be able to verify whether the information produced in the financial statements are of higher quality. And the role of female directors, what is their role? They demand more questions. They would demand more effort by the external auditors. And if the female directors are in the audit committee, therefore, they will be able to exercise better monitoring in this kind of external mechanism. Therefore, we only posit one very, very simple hypothesis. That is, gender diverse boards are likely to use external auditing as their primary mechanism to improve reporting quality. And this actually will improve the ways in which corporate governance listed companies have to comply with. And of course, this is the reason why this is such a difficult paper to be published in accounting and in auditing journal, because we consider this somehow a little bit soft stuff. Because it talks about gender, it talks about diversity, which is very much based in sociology, psychology, and even finance is a lot more open to diversity. And therefore, in accounting, I guess accounting and auditors are a lot more conservative, hence it is extremely difficult. It has taken us from 2008, even now, 7 years, it hasn't been published. But we really feel that the policy the policy reaction by the Hong Kong Stock Exchange has already proven that there is some impact based on our study, based on results of our study. And those literature review show that boards with female directors discuss more difficult and unpalatable issues than all male boards. Well, there has been anecdotal evidence to show that all male boards may have their old boys network. They talk the same language, my apology, Tom, to the male.
The old or the boy that you're...
They would not say young boys network. But what our paper has found is that all the sample that we have used from 2001 to 2011, the male age of those directors, we compare male and female, they are slightly higher. The average age is 61. So in actual fact, it is much higher than the female directors, with their average age is only about 56. So I guess what we are seeing in terms of the glass ceiling is that females are getting in, but the younger females are getting in, because there are more of those being around in the US. And we looked at at least one female director on the board, at least one female director on the audit committee, and also the proportion of the female directors on the board and the proportion in the audit committee. And what we have found, I don't think I have enough time to go through the results. But what has been done is to show that with gender diversity, breaking a bit of glass ceiling, the boards are a lot more effective. And they are likely to exercise greater effort in ensuring that the external monitoring mechanism, the auditors, are going to do their jobs properly. And they will be able to ask them to exert more audit effort, hence all similar control variables that we have used in all the audit fee models. They are all controlled for size, return, performance, corporate governance, using principal analysis, everything else that we have control for. More than 10 of those control variables. We have been able to show that audit fees are higher. So they are the ones who can convince the boards to pay more, because the boards are the ones appointing the external auditors, approving the audit fees, and this is the result that we have found, that female directors on the board, on the audit committee, financial expertise on the audit committee is very similar between male and female, except that they are younger. And yet, with greater audit effort, greater audit fees for similar size companies while controlling for everything else with matched sample, with at least one female director on the board, with no female director on the board. And we have been able to find significant positive association while we have control for all endogeneity, all self-selection bias through matched logit model and everything else. So we've gone through all the robustness to show our conclusion. And the conclusion would be They are positive and significant for, let me go to the end. And also, in addition, we also did specialist auditors. Why are some of the fees higher? Because the likelihood of the female director demanding specialist auditors, which cost more, with more audit effort, the fees are higher. So this is pretty good evidence to show that female directors are likely to move boards towards engaging high-quality auditors and demanding higher audit effort from them to improve earnings quality and informativeness of companies. However, this is all US data with some 9,000 firm years from 2001 to 2011. And we have control for all endogeneity. And the contribution is gender diversity, in fact, increases monitoring. It increases monitoring. Female directors are a lot more risk adverse, hence, they demand the auditors to do more work and to provide higher audit quality, and we show it through the proxy in audit fees. And prior literature is silent on specific actions taken by gender diverse boards. That is, we don't know whether they exercise and demand the external monitoring mechanism like the external auditors to do more work, to improve monitoring of managers and increase oversight over their actions. So by showing that they demand higher audit effort and choose higher quality auditors, it confirms that female directors can affect these changes and result in better earnings quality through audit effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judy. And now Monica Kieser's presentation.
Thank you. While it's loading, let me just say that my paper is not a paper. In fact, what I will be showing you is findings from the OECD Gender Initiative, which is an initiative that the OECD has been engaging on since about 2009. And this has involved a very large number of different areas within the OECD. In fact, we have 10 different directorates working on this gender initiative, which culminated in a large report called Closing the Gender Gap Act Now. And I think even though we launched this report at the end of 2012, I think the slogan still holds true even now, a couple of years later. And what I will show you in my presentation are a couple of findings from this report, as well as a sneak preview of a new report that we're launching on May 21, which looks at inequality. Working title at the moment is In It Together, which we're still discussing, but this is a new report that the OECD is putting out. So I'll just show you a few results that we will be publishing soon. Now, let me start with something that is probably clear to everybody, but it's still worth showing. Women are less likely to be in paid work in all OECD countries than men, and more likely to work fewer hours. And what you see here on the right-hand side is this is full-time equivalent employment rate. So it takes into account the fact that in many countries, many women work part-time. And you see there's a 23 percentage point difference in employment rates in 2013 on OECD average, which is quite large. You see that even in the star-performing country, which is Iceland routinely wins all rankings of the World Economic Forum and many other countries for being the most gender-equal country with most women's empowerment. Even there, we still have a large employment gap between men and women. Iceland, just for those of you who can't really see it, is the country that has the highest rate for men with over 90%. And you can see that the green dot, which is for women, is quite a bit lower than that was for men, so 70 versus 90%. The smallest gaps we have in Sweden, Slovenia, Denmark, Norway. So Not surprising, it's usually always the Nordics which are doing very well in this area. And the largest gaps are in Turkey, this is the country that is at the far right, and Mexico and in Chile. Now, we have looked at what has been happening in terms of employment growth. This is a slide from the new report we will be putting out. And I'd like to acknowledge the presence of its author, Ana Yena Nozal, who has been working and has indeed done all of this work and for this new report in this area. Now, this is employment growth between 1990 and 2007. What we wanted to look at, following up on our flagship publication in 2011 called Divided We Stand, which looked at rising inequality around the OECD, we wanted to know where, in more detail, the inequality was coming from. So we looked at, obviously, because the biggest part of the inequality is coming from the labor markets, we wanted to look at what type of employment had been created. And what you see here on this slide is a breakdown of the employment growth between standard work, self-employed, temporary, and part-time. And blue is standard. And the striking difference here is that for men, in the left panel, you can see that in many countries, a lot of this employment growth has been in standard work compared to the employment growth for women, where you see much more pink, which is part-time work, but also temporary work. So here's the big difference. But you can also see that the growth rates have been higher for women in that the job creation for women is twice as large as that for men overall. And we have, up to the crisis, we had 70% of all jobs created for men were in standard work, while for women, 60% of the jobs created were non-standard work. And that non-standard work was shared equally between part-time and temporary work. And since I pointed out Iceland in the previous slide, here you can see Iceland, which is actually one of the few countries where there was a significant decline in part-time work and a significant, almost as big growth in standard work for women. We've just talked about, this relates to your presentation, women earn less than men. Again, this is no surprise, especially at the top. And so what I'm showing you here is the gender pay gap in earnings for full-time employees. And you can see the blue bars are the median wage gaps, gender wage gaps. The light blue points, dots, are among the bottom 10%. What is the gender gap among the lowest earners? And the gray triangles are the top earners. And what you can see is that this data is actually quite old, I have to say, unfortunately. This dates from 2010. We will have to update this in the future. But it does give you an idea. If you look at the overall OECD average on the right-hand side, you can see that at the bottom, the average is 13%, the average gap. And as we move up then to the median, we get to 16%, and at the top, it's 23%. And in the majority of countries, you can see that the gray triangles are quite far from the bottom and the bottom 10% and the median, with a few exceptions. And let me draw your attention also to Japan here, Japan and Korea, which are the countries with the largest wage gaps. But we also have Germany, which has a very large gap in the full-time employee earnings. Now, we looked at where this came from. And this is very interesting work that looks here now not at the wage gaps for full-time employees, but it looks at the overall annual earnings. And we wanted to know, if you take this earnings data, where do these big differences come from that we see? Now, since this is annual earnings, obviously the fact that women work part-time in very many countries explains a large part of the earnings in the countries where part-time work is very prevalent. For example, here, if you look at the ones where part-time plays the hours worked play the biggest role, There we have Australia, Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Austria, where part-time work is extremely prevalent. But what is interesting here is that the fact that women work less hours doesn't explain everything. On the contrary, there are some countries where there is a lot of other factors are playing an important role. For example, if you look at the left-hand side, you see large unexplained parts, which cover discrimination also. Then you see education in countries like Slovenia, Hungary, Portugal, and Poland, for example. The education is actually mitigating the gender pay gap. The education of women, higher education levels of women are mitigating the wage gap. And then we also have job characteristics, which play a very important role. And here we have, again, Japan, where job characteristics are very, very important for the gender wage gap because the gender pay gap, sorry, not gender wage gap, because in Japan, many women, when they have children, move from regular employment into non-regular employment, which means that they have much worse job characteristics and worse job quality than the regular workers. Now, what we've also looked at in this analysis is what happens when women retire. We're currently running a new project, which we're just getting started on, called Aging Unequally, where we're looking at how inequality compounds over the life cycle. We're looking at different factors and different cohorts. We're looking at this both within generations and across generations. And gender is actually one of the things we're looking at. It's not the only focus of this study. And obviously, there's a lot of compounding of inequality for women, particularly over the life cycle. We know that women have lower earnings. We know that women have shorter careers because they have more career interruptions, that they work more part-time. And then we add to this that women have higher life expectancy than men, and that most pension payments in retirement are adjusted over time to prices, which means that as they live longer in retirement on a price index pension, they lose relative to workers. So relative poverty increases among older women. And here we're taking the total pension income that comes from household survey data and looking at what the gaps are. And not surprisingly, you see that the worst countries with the biggest gaps are those countries where women work part-time and where pension systems have structures where the benefits in retirement are related very closely to previous earnings during the active years. So on the right-hand side, the worst countries we have here is UK, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Germany, for example. Netherlands is known for a very large share of part-time work, both among women, very strongly among women, but also to a certain extent among men. But you can see that the problem for women is much bigger here. And it's interesting to note also that the Netherlands have a flat rate universal pension scheme, a basic scheme, but then they have a very important occupational scheme which tops up the flat rate benefit. And that, of course, is where all of the inequality among men and women comes from. How is this changing over cohorts? Here is what's happening. If you look at, we've put this here for 3 different cohorts. The light gray line is for people born between 46 and 50. Then we have people born between 56 and 60, and then 66 and 70. And you can see that the break of women, the reduction in employment rates around ages 25 to 29 is quite substantial in the oldest cohort, and it's becoming mitigated, but still there is still, even for the youngest cohorts, a substantial break around those most important childbearing ages. And for men, nothing happens, as you can see, which is not surprising. Let me also point out another piece of work that you will find in the gender report. We have looked at how in different OECD and non-OECD countries having more women participate in the labor market might help mitigate labor force declines. And you have here two at the top, two rapidly aging countries, China and Germany. And then on the bottom panel, you have the United States and India, where the labor force is not projected to shrink anytime soon because of much higher fertility rates. And you see the blue line here, the light blue line, which we call the G20 target. G20 leaders in 2014 at their Brisbane summit agreed on a quantitative goal to reduce the gender labor force participation gap by 25% by the year 2025. And if we reach that goal, this is what would happen to labor force participation, labor force in the different countries. And you can see that if there were convergence by 2040, to between men and women, you would get an even higher labor force. And we also translated that into economic growth. I'm not going to go into that here at this stage because we don't have the time, but this is another piece that you can find. And we found, by the way, that with our member countries and policymakers, the economic growth argument is what propelled gender equality discussions and moving forward on policy more than all of the other findings and all of the other equality considerations. Finally, here's a slide that looks at how the increase in female employment has contributed to a decline in household income inequality. Again, this is work from the forthcoming new report on inequality. And we have decomposed here the different effects that you have. We've also done a simulation and looking at what would have happened if the proportion of households with a working female had remained the same as in the mid-1980s. Then household income inequality in OECD countries would have increased by an additional 0.8 of the Gini across OECD countries on average. And the fact that women's work intensity increased lowered household inequality in some, but not in all countries. But there's a counter effect where women, when they go into high-skilled jobs and work more in high-skilled jobs, that increases household income inequality. But the overall impact is that the increase in female employment has led to lower household income inequality overall. Finally, let me just quickly tell you what the OECD is doing going forward. Ministers at the OECD Ministerial Council meeting adopted what we call the OECD Recommendation to promote gender equality in employment and education, employment, and entrepreneurship. Here we have a couple of those very concrete recommendations, policy actions that countries have committed to be working on. It relates also to Judy's presentation on corporate governance. This is another important part of this recommendation. The OECD is now engaging in a monitoring exercise where we're looking what our member countries are doing to implement this recommendation. And we will be reporting back to ministers in 2017 on the progress that countries have been making on this recommendation. We also have, as I mentioned, the G20 commitment to gender equality. It sets it out here. This too we will be monitoring together with other international organizations. And while you might be thinking that this quantitative target is not a hugely ambitious target, the fact that all of the G20 leaders actually committed to this is a huge advance, and I have to say we at the OECD are very proud to having been at the origins of this commitment. Finally, you will find lots and lots of data, lots of interactive tools, updated reports on our website. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Pia Mullaney has a comment. You have to turn that on. That turns me off.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think these were all very interesting presentations looking at somewhat different aspects of the same issue that we're all trying to talk about. I just had a few comments on each of them. Well, actually, more general comments that I think deal with the issue a little bit more broadly, but touch on some of the points raised by each of these presentations. There's an old Chinese proverb that says that women hold up half the sky. And in fact, if you look within the household, you find that women are responsible for most of the economic and financial decisions within the household. And so then we have this question about what happens as you move from the household to the workforce, and why does that change? And Judy brought up the issue of how hard it is to get some of this taken seriously because it's based in sociology and psychology. And I think Monica's last slide actually points us to one of the reasons why we start coming up against some of these issues, which is somewhat softer, which is that traditionally women have been expected to take on the role of caregiving. And this, I think, in part is childcare, but in part also is now elder care. And I think what was very interesting was in your last slide, you talk about some of the ways in which we can actually target the reasons why women have been facing some of these issues. And I think these are universal across OECD countries and even developing countries. And I'll talk a little bit more about developing countries because I think what we see there is somewhat more severe even than we've been seeing in OECD countries and the US and some of the countries talked about by the Top Incomes database. But let me just start by saying I'm coming now from Silicon Valley, and it's interesting because even Silicon Valley, which is considered to be very, very advanced and progressive in many ways, is very focused now on the gender issue. We currently had the case of Ellen Pao, who was working at Kleiner Perkins, which is a very well-known VC company in Silicon Valley, and it was a gender discrimination case. And she actually lost. A jury found that she did not have a sufficient case against Kleiner Perkins. But it's something that brought the issue front and center, and people have been discussing this increasingly in the heart of technology in the US because it's becoming increasingly clear that women are not in any position of equality. We just don't have enough Sheryl Sandbergs and Marissa Mayers when we look at even the heart of the technology industry in the US. Things have been changing a little bit in America. As Monica pointed out, if you look at things over time, we've been seeing some improvements. So the US Census reported that in general, women are earning 78 cents for every dollar that a man earns. However, if you look at women between the ages of 25 and 34, they're earning 93 cents for every dollar. So in part, things are changing over time, and we're finding with the younger generation, if we start looking at the pipeline, we're seeing some improvements over time. And I think this issue of the pipeline is actually a very key issue as we think about moving forward and how we change things. As I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about developing countries. If we look at representation of women on boards in developed countries, we find that it is very low. In general, we're talking about an average of something like 15, 16 to maybe 20%. If we look at China, it's more like 8%. In India, it's about 5%. So we're talking about issues at an entirely different level in developing countries than in OECD countries. The response in India has been interesting. The Securities and Exchange Board of India imposed a quota, like some of the OECD countries, and they just did this last year. But the response to the quota was also interesting, which is something we often see happening in India. Leaders, heads of major companies essentially went out and hired their wives and their mothers and their stepmothers and their mothers-in-law and their cousins, and they stocked their boards with women who were relatives who had absolutely no business experience. And it was very interesting for me when I saw this happening, because many years ago I remember doing focus groups in India, and the government had passed a law that said the village panchayats, the little groups that run the politics within local villages, were required to have women leading them some percentage of the time. And I remember when doing focus groups in Rajasthan that I met the head of the village panchayat, and it was a woman who was in full cover. She was not allowed to expose her face to men. And I asked her about this, and she said, well, I don't actually go for any of the panchayat meetings. I'm not allowed to be there. I am technically the head of the panchayat, but of course I'm not allowed to actually talk to men or interact with men. It's my husband who does everything. So it brings up this issue of when we start thinking about dealing with the glass ceiling, countries in the OECD have shown some amount of success actually by enforcing percentages of women on boards. But the Hong Kong approach is very interesting because I think it acknowledges the fact that when in certain countries you cannot take an approach where you're simply forcing people to do this, and you have to think about approaching it in different ways. So as we think about approaching it in different ways, I wanted to talk a little bit more about this pipeline issue. And Monica, your presentation talked about how we can explain different aspects of the differential, and part of it was education and part of it was job characteristics. And I think we are seeing changes in education across the board in first world and third world countries. In the US, we actually see female college enrollment is higher than male college enrollment, both in undergraduate and in graduate programs, and I think the education channel is a very important one. But the other one that I think we really do need to talk about is the softer issue that I brought up earlier, which is this issue of much of the burden of care falling on women, and how do we actually provide the support that allows women to stay in the pipeline. In India, for example, one study found that nearly 50% of Indian women drop out of the corporate employment pipeline between junior and mid-levels, compared to 29% across Asia. So in India, where we, I think, find more of this burden falling on women, you have increasingly this issue of women falling out. So I think as we think about how to address this issue, we really need to be talking about the pipeline and the different stages along the pipeline. Thank you.
Thank you, Pia. We actually have a fair amount of time. I just want to offer a few brief remarks. I think it would be kind of outrageous if no male responded to all of these very good papers. And you know, I like them all. And I'm sorry to sound like an American politician on this. I basically agree with all of them. But I also, there's a few things about each that I think are worth thinking about. And let me just start with Sarah and Alexandra's. I mean, I like, look, you've done something nobody else has done, and it's like, it would be like coming back, well, Magellan didn't come back, but it would be like when the ship finally showed up in Spain, dumping on them for, well, your map isn't perfect. You know, I mean, it's like there's nothing else out there, and so thank you for this effort. But here's some things maybe just to think about. They're not objections. First of all, I'm really troubled by the business about the capital income versus wages when you go to total income. Because, and you mentioned this in your paper, you're real clear about it, that we know that, you will forgive, this is a pun that maybe not everybody will get, because the family that prays together stays together. That is to say, there's an old slogan, if you take everybody to church, maybe the family will stay together. That's pray with an A. Pray with an E is like wolves. And it's clear to me, when I've done a lot of studies of the super rich in politics, where I actually work with real data, the Forbes data, for example, and also much older income data where people are named from the 20s and 30s. And I've spent actually a considerable amount of time now trying to sort out Mr. and Mrs. and trying to see what the differences are. And the thing one's got to say is there aren't, in most cases, big differences. There's some real famous ones you can sometimes see in the press, but the modal case is the Sheldon and Miriam Adelson case, where they were basically dumping enormous sums of money on the very same far-right Republican candidates. In that sense, where you don't separate, you don't have separate, where you don't easily where you are not easily able to separate out somehow the effect of shifting for tax advantages. This, I think, is going to become really difficult. And the one thing I'm sure of is that an awful lot of stuff in families gets bounced back and forth, even on the equivalent of the American Schedule C, which is a sort of proprietor's income story. I think this is really difficult. I might have some more remarks about that. A second thing that when I looked at your charts and tried to sort of, okay, what's accounting for these differences between these countries? And you can see already we've got a veil. We're not absolutely sure about how big the differences really are. We've got a real margin for uncertainty there. You're real clear about this. It's not, having looked at stuff over time, I have to say I think there's some pretty clear sectoral associations with this, and I think the sector problem really needs some thought. It also affects Judy's paper in a way I'll come to, because you can only match on observable characteristics in that. But here, like for the following, I'm pretty sure that over time, if you're in heavy industry and mining, the women's situation is much worse. I'm also sure that in early industrialization, like the textile firms hated the idea of women's suffrage. And everywhere, that's, for instance, why Seneca Falls went nowhere in the United States, because it was unfortunately pitched head-to-head with the leading sector of the age, which cotton textiles. And that type of problem keeps recurring in history. Once you go to managerial capitalism, though, where you get large firms and they can hire somebody to do it, do the work, then, I mean, I'm not telling you that women can't run firms. The evidence is overwhelming that they can. But it's certainly much easier. You get the following situation, what I call the Mrs. Russell Sage situation, where, I mean, and this you could actually see in the American Gilded Age if you actually start to look at it. You get some tycoon who, you know, is the nicest thing you can say about them is they're thugs and skunks. Okay, they marry a much younger woman. They die. Suddenly, the younger woman is super rich. And in the case of Mrs. Russell Sage, she set up the Russell Sage Foundation, which, so far as I can tell, was actively aimed at undermining everything her husband aimed for in life. I mean, it was the beginnings of much of American social welfare strategies and things like that. And in this, as I was looking at your data this is a funny situation, and it's just very hard to sort through. But for sure, one process where you get capital income, women outlive men. That's just a fact. We may think that's dolorous or not. I'm not urging anyone here in this. This is not a race. I want anyone to win. So for sure, where you have wealthy folks marrying younger women, and I have a feeling that there may be one true cross-cultural generalization. That's it. Then you will see often some very rich women, and they may or may not be taking leadership on even social and political things, but for sure it's going to affect the distribution of income in the top 0.1 decile. I mean, if you're there. And I thought of the case of Spain, where I sort of know some of the folks, and there if for any reason women have, either because their daughters or wives have inherited a lot of money, you may find what you'd think of on the face of it, a patrimonial state, hugely patriarchal, will suddenly turn out to be exactly the opposite. And the reason is because, in fact, the males that were, forgive the plain English here, this is just very little time, that were the problem have passed away. In the case, for instance, I actually looked at how the American, I haven't published on this, but the way the constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote passed. It passed because the Vanderbilts and a string of other women from rich families backed it very strongly, and then Republican Party leaders at the time thought that giving women the right to vote would drown the socialist vote. But in this, I do think that what might be called life cycle in a broad sense, where you're talking about couples, needs some thinking as to what are your expectations for capital income. And at the top, the other thing is that if you're trying to decide what kind of a country would have a better split on the men-women issues, especially in upper incomes, I would guess it would be no heavy industry, no mining, not much of a military, and for reasons that are somewhat opaque, certain types of finance are clearly breeding more inequality between men and women. This is, this can be for any, the extreme case of, I certainly don't believe a word of the Larry Summers line about women in math. I don't believe, but there's no question about the empirical facts, which is that in the sort of highest earning ends of finance, private equity, hedge funds, there aren't many women. And so, that may actually explain some of the British data, where you've got, if I recall rightly, the percentage of the very top was going down. And that's just to say that, well, the financial capital of the world was booming. Now, if we were doing wages, we'd have a totally different story, but we're not right there. So I just think some of these, particularly the sectoral story across women and various types of income in the various countries could use some attention. None of that is to impugn your paper. It's just, okay, now let me just talk for a second about Judy's. Do I believe her tale? Yeah. Look, that she's got to be right. I have a very simple view on this. Think about what an all-male board believes. Rational expectations, real business cycles, no aggregate demand even as a problem, right? That's the economic theory that's conventional in American boards. So, for sure, if you leave in that with any group of people, maybe even passersby walking in randomly, you're probably going to get a better outcome. That's just, and so yes, that you have to be right about this. That on the other hand, do I believe the specific coefficients? Nah, I don't. But I can't. I have nothing better to offer. Your matching thing, you can only match on observable characteristics, and a good deal of the problem here are unobservable characteristics. That's the trick. There are some latent variable models, I know, because I've been messing with them for other reasons. But nobody, the match, it may well be the case, for example, that in those firms that are clever enough to hire, to have women on the board and on the audit, they may have some unobserved characteristics. They just may be clever all the way around, though I doubt it. That type of explanation I'm very skeptical of. But I think the matching story really doesn't dispose of it's not randomization, no matter how many times people tell you it is. And so there's a problem there with the estimates. Now that makes me sort of want to then move to which I think everybody's papers could, as a next step, think about. What Judy's dealing with is the visible world where you can see people out there and you can count them. You don't have to argue about anonymous taxpayers whose you cannot get their names or whatever. And, if you start counting heads in the visible institutions, well, you can see, on the Forbes list, there are more women's Forbes list of, or I should say for people not from the United States. That's the list of super rich people. And nobody thinks it's perfect, but it's not bad. There are more women on that than there were, but they're not enormous numbers. The visible head count on boards is, yeah, there are more of them, but they're not in enormous numbers. And for sure, when you do this, you will find some sectors overrepresented in that. It's rough. The problem it's not, I think, because of the intrinsic nature of the work, but some stuff maybe for whatever reason there's something blocking that, if only the older patriarchal character of the management with the age of the firm or something. But at any rate, I think it would be worth, just take your data on taxes and correlate it with the visible evidence of women in executive positions. which is a simple head count and pretty easy to do now, you might really find something very illuminating. And it might suddenly jump out at you stuff that you can't otherwise see. And I just think that mixing what I'll call the tax stuff seems to me to be, well, on the other hand, it's very interesting and it's data, you're right, there's no place else. I mean, I don't, to the extent you use the World Top Income Database, did you folks pull your data from?
Related, but there is no gender.
Yeah, right, that's the problem. That's the one INET unfortunately helped pay for, I'm sorry to say, but we didn't design it. We just thought Piketty and company had a good idea and tried to support it. But to the extent that you can supplement the tax data with some like explanatory variables design and also confirming from visible evidence, it's tough to miss the fact that, well, gee, there are relatively few women CEOs. Which incidentally, in your paper, I noticed you controlled for strong CEO, but not for whether they were women or men. And so it's like, I just think some mix of these strategies would be probably a good move fairly early on if you're trying to make sense of why does this stuff happen. Anyway, that's my comment. So we can now throw it open to the floor. We've got actually 10 or 15 minutes. And nothing terrible would happen if we went 2 or 3 minutes over. Who would like to comment? Well, all right, first there, and we'll just go right around to keep. But I think it probably makes sense, unless the question is real narrow and specific, to put 2 or 3 questions up and then let the panel respond. So, your question?
Thanks very much. I have 2 questions, actually. So one is for Judy and the other one is for Monica, the report. So my first question to Judy is, I find it a little bit like this normative underlying idea behind the study that somehow hiring women, like this, this pragmatical view or this, that to hire women in boards is good for you and therefore you I don't know to what extent justifying women equality somehow on the sense that it's on a useful thing to do. I don't know, if we're thinking about gender equality, I think this is a reason just because we are women and we are equal, but not because there is a use to hiring women. So I don't know to what extent that would be actually doing a favor to women equality in this respect. And my second question is to Monica. I'm a little bit confused about what is inherently wrong about part-time labor for women, in the sense that, well, I think there is an indisputable fact that women have to interrupt their careers when they have children. And I don't know to what extent is it really a problem that we find, or that there is indeed, that if we have the option as women to work part-time, then this, I would say, this could also be seen as a good thing. And I think in the Netherlands, there is a very strong culture that favors part-time labor. And this is actually something that is really, really praised in the Netherlands, and especially women, when they have some time off to kind of spend the day with their children, which is usually the day that children go out, leave school early. So, in a sense, this seems to me like a good thing, so I don't understand why it's seen immediately or why it's obviously a bad thing, or something that we would want to, like this difference with males, why we would want to have women always going into full-time jobs, while perhaps part-time jobs can also be a very good thing. Thank you.
My name is Alina, and I live. Oh, sorry. My question is related to what would be the disadvantages on the very long term and long term if more women in the developed countries get long working hours and full-time jobs, and they also reach higher levels in their careers, like CEOs and. Is it clear? Or yeah, that's my question. What would be the disadvantages? Would we see a decline in birth rates? Would we see an aging population in Europe? Would we see more independent women and less marriages and more divorce? Thank you.
I would add 2 points to the wonderful speech of all of you, especially thinking of one of the most machista country in the world, France, I must say. There are 2 questions. First, I would start by the universities. Full professors, female full professors, the ratio of full professors in the university in France is one of the lowest in the world, lower than in India, much lower than in China and Italy. It's obvious that there is some kind of a discrimination, apartheid system in the universities. So, most of my brightest students were female, but they told me, we have no hope. The second problem is in the political structure. We are obviously no more in a true democratic country. All our politicians became rich by marrying rich heiresses. And, for instance, the 2 wealthiest French politicians on one side are the former one, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who married the heiress of the Wildenkind family, and Mr. Sarkozy married the richissime Carla Bruni, whose family worked for the Mussolini regime. You see, I was a close friend through my mother of Simone de Beauvoir. And Simone de Beauvoir told me, we are completely despaired. France is going back to some Catholic medieval age. So thank you for all of you.
I think the panel needs, it's not that I don't want to take questions. I think the panel needs to respond so that make sure we got enough time. Then if we have time, we'll take more questions. You want to just go right across here? What would you like to say in response to these?
I wanted to point out that in our data, compared to your comments, we stopped to the top 0.1%. So the very, very, very top we don't have in the data. So these people you mentioned are not there, but I take your point. The other thing is that we were trying to decompose by sources of investment income for the countries where we have this information. Is it pension income? Is it dividends? But we've run into data problems, and it's being worked out. But this is definitely a route we're trying to go down to get some sort of information on what you raised, the points you raised, because I think it's a very important point. And I know in Australia, that's another case you raised. Why are there so many women? Does it correspond to CEO-type data? And some data is being published now, so this is another thing I think we need to look at. So, yeah, your points are things we have in mind to do, definitely. Yeah.
Yes, if I can add one thing. So I think that one of the contributions that we would like our paper to give is precisely trying to understand what happens to capital income, and especially whether over time things have changed, and therefore it could be that in the past there were many women inheriting wealth, and then this has died out. This seems to be there in the New Zealand data. And so now wages could be a more important source of income for women, but also seeing how this has changed over time could be valuable. And I liked your suggestions of focusing on sectorial composition in different countries as a mean to understand why the share of women in different countries could be different in some sense. So this is something that we are going the suggestion that we are going to take up for sure. I think that at this stage we are still very much in the descriptive phase and trying to get the most out of our data, but we certainly have in mind the idea of trying to understand better why we get what we get. So certainly the explanation part is an important part of our effort, one which we haven't yet started because we wanted to get the data right to start with, but it's certainly something that we need to do.
Yes, there were two questions to me about part-time and what would happen if more women have careers like men. The part-time isn't a problem. Parents like it, but I think it's a problem if it's only women who are working part-time. And what most of we see our member countries moving to more interest in promoting sharing of both paid and unpaid work. We're currently working on a project at the request of the German government that looks into what type of policy measures will promote better sharing between the parents. Because what many women do not know when they engage in long-term part-time work is what the impact will be on their earnings in the long term, how difficult it will be to get back after very long times in part-time to get back into full-time, and what the impact will be on retirement incomes. And I think all of these things need to be measured. And it's related to the second question on what is the impact on fertility, divorce, and careers, and so on. We've been looking at the fertility data. In the past, it used to be, as you say, that fertility rates were lower in those countries where more women were working and participating in the labor force. That has completely changed. Now it's the reverse. Women will be working and having children if you let them do both. What we see is if you don't let them to do one, they will either not work at all, maybe have children. But if you take a country like Germany, like Austria, for example, like Japan, fertility rates are extraordinarily low in those countries where women are faced with the choice of either having a child or forsaking all the investment they've made in higher education and so on. And it's not only in the US where women are now graduating in higher numbers, it is all over the OECD. So that's not an issue. What happens to divorce rates? I'm not so sure, actually. I'm not so sure that it means if women have a career, they're more likely to become divorced. I think it's worse to think about what happens to women who are divorced, which we know is the single biggest social risk for women, if they've been working part-time in a country where there's no childcare. They cannot, and they're changing the alimony rules now, but they're not changing the childcare rules.
Judy?
Thank you for your comments. I think maybe I wasn't very clear. in my presentation, there's really no normative view about women, being hired into those boards that they will do better. Empirical studies in accounting have shown that female directors on boards actually is highly associated with higher earnings quality. In this particular case, in psychological literature, women have been found that they do not belong to the old boys network as a result, or young boys network. As a result, they will do more to justify their existence. They do not have help in the boards and the audit committee. As a result, they do more work, more homework, they are less confident, and as you know, in this particular case, they are more sensitive to their minority status, and as a result, they will demand more, they question more, they need to justify their worth. And this is the basis of the literature. And what we have been able to find, is linking that to higher audit quality and better monitoring. I also like to respond to Pia's comments about in Hong Kong, in our particular case, compared to what she has shared with us in India. One of the reasons why Hong Kong doesn't follow strict quota, 40% in Norway, 25% in the UK, is because there isn't available a lot of professional women who have the experience to sit on boards. Therefore, we believe more in substance over form. So rather than putting just any single woman on the boards, like relatives, family, without any expertise, the suggestion is to allow the listed companies to deliver results, to deliver what the female should be able to achieve: better performance, better monitoring, better corporate governance, and therefore no quota. So I think we are going through different evolutionary stages, and this may be the answer for developing countries. But I also like to respond or share with others, particularly about China, to Monica's presentation. Early childhood education, I totally and strongly agree with OECD's recommendation, particularly in China, because we have so much fewer female babies being born, if at all. Okay? The one-child policy over the last 15, 20 years has really resulted in one male child. And as a result, there is a total imbalance and childhood education affecting millions, tens of millions of kids with childcare, and the parents are in the urban cities. That is actually, I refer to the paper done by Jim Heckman on early childhood intervention and being implemented in China right now, finishing the experiment with 500,000 kids, to say that if you teach the caregivers nutrition, cognitive development, physical development properly, it's going to lead to better, hopefully, better equality for those few girls being around. They have nothing, So I think this is what is worrying me in the long run, that there will be too few females in China that would actually rise to the ranks, and they would never get there. Thank you. And also with Tom's comment, I totally agree with you. We use Hillman's model just based on observable determinants. Since it is unobservable, these are the limitations of these empirical papers. I totally agree with you. Thanks.
We're actually quite a bit over noon, and I think, therefore, I'm sorry to say we have to stop. I would like to thank everybody on the panel for their contributions and for your questions.